Welcome to the new sound of online radio. Welcome to the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network. 'Cause you make me feel like I've been locked out of heaven. A mix of today's hits and hard-to-find favorites, combined with the most entertaining and intriguing talk anywhere. This is your sound. This is the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network at UBNradio.com.
You're listening to the Dr. D Show about neuropsychology and well-being. Get the knowledge you must have to live a powerful, positive life. The Dr. D Show. Here for you.
Welcome, listeners, to the Dr. D Show today. Very wonderful to have all of you with us today. As usual, some disclaimers. This show is psychoeducational in essence. It's not meant to replace professional mental health advice or therapy. Also, some of the topics that we cover on the show are not appropriate for the younger population. Hence, your discretion is advised. I first would like to open the show today with just giving my very, very deep condolences to the families of the victims of the Orlando nightclub shooting that has occurred at the beginning of this week. It's just so heartbreaking to look at the pictures and the faces of all of these young, vibrant individuals who just led regular lives, and with everything that comes with a regular life, and how the right of living their life has been taken away from them, and the right of their loved ones to experience them is gone. Based on hate, based on misconceptions, based on mental illness, based on so many horrible factors that came together to create this kind of outcome. And I just want to share a prayer from the heart, both to the victims' souls that have gone through this and that may never know, hopefully ever sorrow again. And for all the families who are now suffering and mourning the loss of their loved ones. I'm always amazed how humanity cannot simply separate between ideology to the sanctity of life. There's got to be a fundamental difference in the way that we process concepts in life and information. We need to be able to respect other individuals' lives at the same time that we may disagree on politics, on religion. There's got to be a fundamental understanding, okay? This is very, very basic, that people, as long as they don't take the lives of others and hurt others, people have the right, okay, to live life the way they want to. You know, I might have certain types of religious beliefs, and I might believe that those are the way to live life, but that does not give me the entitlement to go take somebody else's life. They still have free choice. That whole concept of free choice and the journey of the soul, some religions have those concepts and some religions perhaps don't. Some religious people understand that everybody has the right to choose to live the life the way that they believe they should. And some people don't. But when we come to those types of differences, we can't afford bringing that home. There's got to be a difference between belief systems and politics to the sanctity of life. And one has to understand that when your life is threatened, okay, when your existence is threatened, you're going to make different kinds of decisions. Okay, you might have... Hello, Dr. Langman?
Yes.
Hi, I'm just about to close a topic here, so hang on with us, please.
Okay.
When we are talking about the sanctity of life, we mean that there are times when politics and religious beliefs and other types of concepts need to be set aside and kept in a particular boundary in order to let other people around us have the basic right to live the life the way that they would like or choose to live. And so I really do hope that more and more of us can take these types of unfortunate and horrific situations and find a way to grow in terms of the way that we are seeing, that we are processing the value of life and giving it the proper respect. With that in mind, I am very excited to have with us on the show Dr. Peter Langman. Welcome to the show. And could you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful. Welcome to the show. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read your bio just for our listeners to know who's with us. Dr. Peter Langman is a psychologist whose work on school shooters has received international recognition. His book, Why Kids Kill: Inside the Minds of School Shooters, was named an outstanding academic title and was translated into multiple languages: German, Dutch, and Finnish. His latest book, School Shooters: Understanding High School, College, and Adult Perpetrators, was published in 2015, so this is very fresh. Dr. Langman's research has been cited in congressional testimony on Capitol Hill, has been interviewed by the New York Times, the Today Show, CBS, 2020, Fox, CNN, and BBC, and over 200 other news outlets in the United States, Canada, Europe, and other countries. After the Sandy Hook attack, his recommendations on school safety were presented to President Obama by the CEO of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Langman has trained thousands of professionals in education, mental health, and law enforcement on identifying potential school shooters. He maintains the largest online collection of materials relating to school shooters at schoolshooters.info. And for the viewers, the ones who are actually viewing the show, we are having under Dr. Langman's the actual website that you can go and visit. It's a wonderful resource. I will tell you that I've used it multiple times myself, and unfortunately is becoming more and more valuable in a way since we have increase of number of shootings in the United States, statistically wise. Dr. Langman, welcome to the show. It's a great honor to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So what I always like to do on the show is start at the beginning. And the first thing I guess the first question I'll bring your way is, what sparked your interest in looking into this area in terms of professional research?
Okay, well, as I'm sure you remember, back in 1999, on April 20th, there was the attack at Columbine High School. And at that time, I was doing my doctoral internship in psychology at a psychiatric hospital for children and adolescents. And just 10 days after Columbine, on April 30th, a 16-year-old boy was admitted to the hospital because he was seen as a Columbine-type risk. He had a hit list, he was engaging in some strange and disturbing behavior, and he came in the facility, and I was assigned to evaluate him both quickly, but also in terms of much of a risk that he posed mass murder. And at the time, there was really no literature on the topic of school shooters and how to evaluate them. And he was the first, but he was not the last of such cases. And over a 12-year period, I saw a pretty steady trickle of such cases, maybe one or two a year, who were potential school shooters. And I just started studying the cases coming through the hospital, but also studying the cases that actually occurred all across the country.
And what are some of the main findings? So when people think about, a school shooter, some of us think in horror, could that be my child? Could that be my child's friends? It's pretty horrific to people. And I flew to Sandy Hook to talk to some individuals in leadership, for example, who were involved in the case. And you really find out that it's not as simple as people think. But what would you say to a family who's concerned? What are the main factors that maybe spark a concern?
Well, there's a lot to take into account, and as you said, it's not a simple phenomenon. And if I were talking to parents, I would want to know why I'm concerned in the first place. And reasons for concern could be such as having a fascination with Eric Harris, Dylan Cleveland, Columbine killers, going to websites, school shootings.
Dr. Langman, I'm going to jump right in because we can't hear you. If you have any electronics that are open around, or computers or laptops, if you can turn them off, because we're hearing static.
Okay, how is this?
So far, so good now. So apologies for interrupting you. Go ahead.
Okay, so I would talk to the parents about why they were concerned, and were the children showing interest in school shootings, an unusual interest in weapons and violence, and try to talk to them about what they're seeing and see if there might actually be reason for concern.
And you're kind of touching on a very important point, which is the communication. It sounds like for many of the cases, the shooter came out before the shooting and sort of communicated either via social media or with people around them or with friends their rage or their interest in their anger and their rage about with society and with maybe with what's going on in their own life. And it sounds like somehow there was a disconnect for that information to reach to the right place where somebody would do something.
I heard most, but I part of it at the end. Can you hear me okay?
It's kind of in and out. Your connection is in and out.
Okay. Can you hang on just a minute, please?
Sure. So while we're waiting for Dr. Langman, for our listeners, just to review, we're touching on on the fact that there is information normally that's out there about a particular shooter. Normally, the shooter communicates frustration earlier. We saw that at the case of the Santa Barbara shooting case with Roger Elliott. Videos, YouTube videos, social media postings, websites that have to do with violence. And so, Dr. Langman, you with us?
Yes.
Great.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yes, very good. And so I was just mentioning Roger Elliott, for example, from Santa Barbara, who communicated his frustration on social media, etc. So just somehow there's a disconnect between, the cry out that those individuals do put out and our ability to detect that in time.
Right, and what you're talking about is what is called leakage, when the perpetrators leak their intentions. And sometimes it's very direct, and other times it's more indirect. And, part of the efforts to prevent such shootings is educating people about leakage, the warning signs, and what to do when they hear such comments about wanting to commit a school shooting, or maybe it's less direct than that. Maybe it's just admiring someone else who has committed an attack. But if people, parents, teachers, students, and so on, all are familiar with the warning signs, then we're in a better place to prevent potential attacks.
Now, from your experience, is that sometimes information, mental health information, is gathered about the person early on. So, for example, with Adam Lanza, he was in the system from the get-go, almost, in the mental health system. Roger Elliott was in the system for a long period of time. And it seems to be that right after they become adults, something happens where they get dropped out of the system. Maybe there is no follow-up. They're now adults, so it's not a parental requirement anymore. It's their own right. And it just seems to be that when they're on their own, they're deteriorating. What would you say to that?
Yes, well, certainly people, when they reach a certain age, have the right to refuse treatment. And treatment cannot be forced upon them unless they're perceived to be a danger to themselves or to other people. And in the absence of that kind of danger, you cannot force someone into any kind of mental health treatment. So that's one issue. And the other issue is, most people with any kind of mental health issues are never going to become violent. So the fact that Adam Lanza had intermittent contacts with the mental health system throughout his life, in no way predicts what he ended up doing. So that's the other factor to keep in mind.
Vast majority of individuals who get mental health treatment never become violent in general.
Right. So the history of mental health treatment is not predictive of mass murder. So that's, a big concern, that we don't want to stigmatize mental illness by connecting it with violence. On the other hand, sometimes violence is committed by people who are very psychologically disturbed. So we just have to maintain a balance in how we present that.
Now, but I think what I was trying to get to in terms of the mental health component is that we want to try and reach out to those individuals. We want to try to stop it if we could, potentially. But I think in a way it's a difficult situation because, you don't punish someone for something they haven't done yet. And so in a way, we can worry about someone who might go do something like that. We might identify them as a person of risk. But then what? If they haven't done yet the crime, you can't, you wouldn't be punishing them, such as locking them up or taking away their rights. That would not be just, and that's not how the system should or does work. So
that's yes. So what I was going to say was, in some cases, there is no crime until the violent act. But in many cases, there either have been threats, which might constitute an illegal action, or there's the illegal gathering of firearms by underage people, or they're building bombs, which is against the law. You can't be building explosives and setting them off. So in some cases, there have been a long series of illegal behaviors that could have come to someone's attention, but generally did not.
And and I think that there were times where it was getting close. So when we read about Roger Elliott, the police was called at one point to look at him quite early right before the attack. I think it was very close duration of time, and he was high functioning enough to make them feel that everything is fine. And
right.
So that makes it more difficult.
Yes, in the absence of an actual crime or evidence that the person's a danger to self or other, as I said, the police cannot take action. So that is, a difficult situation. We want to keep people safe, but we also can't take away their rights without there being clear reason to do so.
So it does, but you did mention important points where they could have things around them, and they normally do, right? They might be driving around with a gun, or they might have explosives, or they might have a non-permitted access to weapons, etc. And then you also mentioned the threats. So I think that's kind of important to summarize. Now, in terms of factors that maybe do come together to create that type of storm, and it is difficult to, it's not one factor or another, as you indicated. It's just sort of like a combination of factors. But if you'd had to describe a profile of a school shooter, that there are multiple factors that come into play, what would that be?
Okay, originally, like 15 years ago, people were looking for the so-called profile of a school shooter. And the consensus today is there is no one profile. But what my research has found is that from a psychological perspective, the perpetrators typically fall into one of three categories. So I can talk about each of those three profiles if you want to use that term.
Sure.
Okay. The first type is what I call the psychopathic school shooter. And this would be someone like Eric Harris. And psychopaths are very narcissistic. They live for themselves. They don't have a proper sense of morality or empathy. They don't care if they hurt other people. They may even be sadistic and actually get a thrill from having power to hurt or ultimately kill other people. So they're kind of lacking in basic conscience and regard for human life. They're easily enraged when they don't get what they want because they're so narcissistic. So that's one type of perpetrator that we see among the school shooters.
Well, and what would be the second one?
Okay, second type is what I call the psychotic school shooter, and this would be someone with a serious mental illness like schizophrenia, which means they may be hearing voices telling them to do things. They may have delusions, most commonly paranoid delusions that other people are out to hurt them. Sometimes they have grandiose delusions. So these are people who are not fully in touch with reality. And they also tend to feel very alienated. They have poor social skills. They don't function well. So they're very unhappy. They're full of anguish. They envy other people. And on top of that, they may be paranoid or hallucinating.
Would you say that Roger Elliott was fitting that category?
Actually, it's Elliot Rodger.
Oh, Elliott Rodger, yeah.
And, interesting you should mention him because in my analysis, he has elements of both of those types. That he had kind of the narcissism, the entitlement, the lack of empathy, the sadistic streak that you see among the psychopathic shooters. But he also had the unusually poor social skills and some paranoid thinking and really grandiose thinking that suggests he was not fully in touch with reality. So for Elliot Rodger, I see him as having features of both of those types.
And what would be the third type?
The third type I call the traumatized school shooter. And these are the kids from the really horrendous family backgrounds. In virtually every case, one parent at least is a drug addict or alcoholic, sometimes both parents. There's usually domestic violence, there's child abuse, physical abuse, sometimes there's sexual abuse, either within the family or outside the family. Because of all this dysfunction and chaos, the kids may bounce around from one parent's house to another parent's house to a grandparent, sometimes through multiple foster homes. So there's no stability. There's chronic stress, chronic change on top of severe trauma year after year after year. And eventually they can't deal with it and they just lash out.
Yeah, and there is definitely a strong component of rage, at least with the last two groups that you mentioned that seem to be. I want to touch on something, going back to the case of Elliot Rodger. There was a sort of, for a little while, a phenomena that was happening a lot in media, talking about the potential, and that touched actually also on the Adam Lanza case, on either having ADHD or autism, and therefore those ones were, unfortunately, this was a very erroneous statement, those ones were leading or causing or were a primary factor, which obviously is not true. But I think there is a sense of confusion to some extent in the public in terms of what does it mean to be socially dysfunction and seeing that as a symptom versus understanding that that was a trait or a factor or a part of the overall diagnosis of a particular shooter. That's not necessarily something that was a dominant factor. I think that the idea of social dysfunction is not really properly understood, and I thought it would be a great area to expand on.
Yeah, you raise a good point. People like Adam Lanza and Elliot Rodger and also Sung Hui Cho, the Virginia Tech shooter, all were people who struggled socially throughout their lives. And in all three cases, there was speculation maybe there was some sort of autism spectrum disorder going on. And I can understand why, because in autism you do have, the social deficits, but you can have social deficits for other reasons as well.
Exactly.
And it's not clear that any of those perpetrators really were on the autism spectrum. Adam Lanza was seen at the Yale Child Study Center, which is, one of the world's leading institutes to study autism spectrum disorders, and they did not diagnose him with that. They were not convinced. They saw him as having really a crippling social anxiety, which is a very different diagnosis than autism or Asperger's, which is in that same spectrum. So I can understand, like I said, why people might wonder about that, but there are many reasons why someone could be socially awkward, have deficits in that domain beyond being on the autism spectrum.
This definitely seems to be a sense for myself as a clinician, and I know for many of my colleagues, that we are still, as a field, developing with clearly communicating what are the boundaries, the diagnostic boundaries of autism, and when people are actually should be diagnosed with it and when individuals should not be diagnosed with it. And it just seems to be that every once in a while we have a more popular diagnosis, perhaps because we know more about it or because we have more research done in that area, that more clinicians learn about it and develop at times, some clinicians develop at times a bias to overdiagnose as a result that condition, where it might not necessarily be true. So I think that autism we're still evolving, although many of us have good diagnosticians have a sense of the clear boundaries, but diagnosis can be made in a more, in all sorts of settings that might not have enough exposure to the disorder and might end up overdiagnosing that conditions simply based on parental reports, teachers' reports, and general idea that if socialization is off, therefore it must be autism. And we know the criteria for autism is much larger than that.
Right. It's much more than just poor social skills. And there's also different ways kids can have poor social skills. So, again, as you're saying, it's a complicated situation, and we don't know as much as we would like to know about different diagnostic categories. And just to go back to Adam Lanza and Sung-Hui Cho, what we may have been seeing in those cases is what turned out in adulthood to be schizophrenia. But, you don't diagnose schizophrenia in a 3-year-old because he's a little different. You have to wait until he's much older. But that might have been what schizophrenia looked like in childhood before the psychotic symptoms became present. So, we don't even know enough about schizophrenia to always be able to distinguish it from other diagnoses. But I think in those two cases of Lanza and Cho, my impression is by the time they committed their shootings, they were probably schizophrenic.
I think what you're saying is so important because it's touching on a larger concept in psychology and in diagnosis, that it's not a black and white static state, our mental health. It is, conditions can be comorbid. So for our listeners, that means you could have more than one condition at the same time. And often individuals with a mental health disorder might suffer not just from one disorder, but 2 or even 3. And what you're saying is that it's really not static, it is developmental. And so whichever diagnosis that be or a condition, many conditions develop over time, they change, and their symptoms may look different or may not be fully expressed in childhood. But then as the person becomes an adult or as life stressors come along, the disorders becomes more clear. So I think that's such an excellent point to understand. Let me ask you about sexuality of shooters, because there's speculations in that area, and there's some evidence of impotency or lack of power and or lack of success with reaching out to mates. What would you say in that area?
In many cases, apart from the three types I just talked about, the psychopathic, psychotic, and traumatized, one of the things all three types often have in common is romantic failures. Sexual failures, marital failures, and I think that's a huge issue for them because that's such a central aspect of one's life. And for the teenagers, typically, they either never had a girlfriend or maybe briefly dated, and then the girl broke up with them. And we see many shooters, when they have a target in their attack, and not all attacks are targeted, some are very random, but when it is a targeted attack, one of the common targets is girls or women, the people who rejected them or broke up with them. So if you look at the concept of victim selection, who were the targeted victims in the attack as a way to understand the motivation of the attack, that would suggest that those romantic or sexual failures were devastating.
This is a great point. And I think in a society, our current social trends perhaps put even more emphasis on sexual relationships at a younger age than maybe we've had historically. And this is not something that I'm saying because I know the research behind it. It's just a hypothesis. But it just seems to be that sexuality becomes a topic for younger people at a younger age, at a younger and younger age. And I can only imagine that when someone is consistently unsuccessful in that, already having social issues, that can become sort of an unbearable pressure on these individuals. And when they continuously get rejected, because they come across odd and because of various kinds of reasons and social oddities, it just can create this incredible rage that they have.
Yes, and I have a concept that I write about. It's not strictly my concept. Other people have addressed this too, and that's what's often called either a failure of manhood or a sense of damaged masculinity, that these identities, the identities of these perpetrators, are very shaky. And romantic rejection is just one more blow to what's already a very shaky male identity.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Now, let me ask you this. It's interesting because, part of the assumption is always, well, if somebody goes to do a crime, a horrific crime like this, there must be, and that's a myth, of course, but that's something that some people erroneously believe in. They must be cognitively impaired, education-wise or intelligence-wise, or they must be coming from a very poor, abandoned family. And you did talk about the third category of individuals who just had trauma, not necessarily a financial issue, but more of a consistency issue and lack of family care. But I think it's important to touch on the point that actually many of the school shooters do not come from poverty.
Right. I would say most do not. Often, as you mentioned, the traumatized shooters not only have all that family dysfunction, but they tend to come from the lower end of the economic spectrum, because if the parents are drug addicted or alcoholic, they're not going to be functioning very well in any kind of consistent work setting. However, most shooters are not in that category, and they tend to be middle class to upper middle class occasionally. So most of these shooters not only are coming from the middle class, but most of them are average to above average intelligence. So these are not the kids who are flunking out because they're cognitively limited. Occasionally, shooters have been, academically behind. They've been in special education and so on. But overall, these are fairly bright kids, as I said, average to above average intelligence.
Yes, I think that's such an important point to touch on. Another area that I find very interesting is the concept of racism It seems to be that with some of the shooters, and we talk about Cho, and we talk about Elliot Rodger had that, and some other ones. There is involvement or preoccupation, cognitive preoccupation with the concept of race.
And what we see with Elliot Rodger is that he was biracial, and that was a big issue for him. His mother was Asian, his father was English, and they all immigrated to America when he was a child. And he was very aware of not being fully white. And it's interesting that when he sought to have women in his life, he wanted only white women, blonde-haired white women, as if he wanted sort of the whitest of the white. And he wrote in his autobiography about his rage, not only seeing other young men with white women, but especially when he saw non-white men with white women. That really enraged him.
And it was interesting that he targeted a sorority house with white, blonde women, and that his partners at his apartment, which he ended up killing, were Asian.
Yes. And I don't know if he killed them because they were Asian or just because they happened to be his roommates, and he had some feuds with them, at least one involving the police. So there was animosity with his roommates. I don't know if their Asian identities were part of that or not, but you make a good point. It could have been, because his own Asian identity really troubled him.
And I know that this kind of goes into psychodynamic analysis of individuals, but I think in general, I wonder about that because Elliot Rodger mentioned Hitler a lot, and a lot of the findings in his apartment were related to Hitler at some point, or Nazism. And Hitler himself, when we read Hitler's biography, there's referring to his troubled concerns with his own original background coming from a Jewish lineage on one side. And I find that interesting that there is sort of, and that could be there or could be not, because we don't have enough evidence. But I do find that interesting that there is sort of a rage against a component of yourself that perhaps that you dislike, that you see as inferior, that you might end up blaming your problems in that perceived inferior component of the self. That is so fundamental in terms of, genetically, there's not something that one can do much about. And
right. And as we said, Elliot Rodger wrote about that in his autobiography, which, by the way, is on my website if people are interested. It's a remarkable document because it's rare to have a mass murderer leave such a window into his own mind. And for anyone interested in trying to get inside the head of a killer like Elliot Rodger, it's a remarkable document.
It is. It's an excellent read. I read it at least 3 times, and that's in entirety. I think it's 143 pages or so, but it is amazing because it also shows that many components of him were very intelligent. And he was able to choose words and describe things in a certain way that was more sophisticated than you would expect a disturbed person.
Right. He was intelligent and articulate, and yet there were some key things missing in his psychological functioning, including poor social skills. He just didn't know how to go up and talk to a girl. So he wanted a girlfriend desperately, but he didn't have the skills to make that happen. And he didn't seem to even realize he needed skills. He seemed to think it was enough that he wore expensive clothing and drove a nice car and that women would just throw themselves at him because of those externals. He didn't seem to even recognize the need to establish any kind of relationship by talking to somebody.
Right. In fact, one of the girls that was interviewed that apparently was in contact with him in school described that he actually would come, when he would come on to a girl, he would be quite scary. And that's part of the reason why girls did not want to talk to him. They were actually scared of him, which I don't know that he even realized the way that he was coming across.
Yeah, I don't think he had the ability to reflect on his own behavior.
Right.
And without that ability, he couldn't grow because he didn't realize there was anything wrong with what he was doing. He just blamed women for being cold and rejecting.
Right, and we do see, we call it often in psychology the theory of mind, or being able to see things from another person's perspective. And we do see that problem also existing with individuals with autism. Although, again, it's just an aspect of a social dysfunction component. Now, something that, there were different types of controversy with it is the effect of gaming, video games, and spending time online. Now, for clinicians, we all know that spending many, many hours on social media, on the internet, and isolating from other people is a symptom of individuals who are already struggling with social communication. But some of the controversy out there, is it that spending so much time on social media, is it changing the person's development? Is it changing their brain? What would you say to that?
There's a lot of research about the impact of violent media on children, and it's been going on for decades.
Oh, you're getting just a bit disconnected. We cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. All right. If you could repeat that, please.
Okay. I said, there's been research going on for decades about the impact of violent media on children. And generally, from what I've read, the consensus is, yes, it does have a negative impact. But you have to keep in mind, who is the child to begin with, and how much exposure do they have, and what else is going on in their lives. So there's no simple correlation between a violent video game or a violent movie and committing an act of violence. 10 million kids could play the same violent video game and never kill anybody. But Eric Harris maybe played that game over and over and over and really immersed himself in it and used it to kind of psych himself up in preparation for the attack. So, someone who's already on that path or perhaps vulnerable to influence, that video game violence or movie violence may be part of what, helps them go out and actually do it. And there's anecdotal evidence that that's the case.
Yeah, and Adam Lanza also spent a lot of time playing those types of games, and so there's other cases as well. But I think you basically said the important thing, which is you said in a sense, who is the child, the level of impact on them, what else is going on. You're basically touching also on the concept of predisposition. Individuals are born with different genetic predisposition and certain traits that they have that they might be more vulnerable to continue and develop. And if those are negative traits, they playing video games might tap into those traits and exacerbate those negative traits, where for those particular people, while it might not do the same for another child. One child might be able to play for half an hour and cognitively disconnect from what they have done and go on to about doing other things. And another child can become cognitively constantly preoccupied and with what they played and become obsessed with what they were doing and not able to disconnect from it. So that's such an important point as well, that it's sort of educate the child relatively to their own ways, or basically based on their own personality makeup. Is there an area that you feel we only have about 5 minutes left? We're actually, what I would like to do is ask you if there's any other area that you feel the listeners could benefit from, and then I would like to discuss your books very quickly.
Okay, well, just to kind of wrap up then, there's no one profile of a school shooter, and there's no one type of school shooting. We lump all kinds of attacks together. As I made reference to earlier, some attacks are very targeted against specific people, and others are completely random against anyone in the vicinity. So we might call all of those school shootings, but what's driving them, the motivation behind them, the purpose of them, may vary dramatically. So just a word of caution that we can't really talk about school shooters as if they're all the same, or school shootings
Right.
as if they're all the same. There's a lot of variation, and it's a very complicated phenomenon.
It is. It is. And Dr. Langman, you wrote 2 books. I read the first one, Why Kids Kill, and we now have the second book from 2015. I will have to get that one as well. We're just posting them right now online for our viewers to see. Where can they get the books?
Well, the books are available online, whether it's Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or lots of other outlets. They might even be in a Barnes & Noble bookstore. I can't promise that, but in some cases they are. Depends where you live, perhaps. So they're easily available online, though.
And that's great. And another thing is, so if someone has a concern, okay, they have a child, or they know somebody, or they teach somebody, they have a concern, a genuine concern about a young person who might end up doing or wanting to do something, or makes threats, all the different signs that we talked about, where should they go?
It could be that they would talk it over with someone at the school, a guidance counselor, a school psychologist. They could go to a private psychologist for a consultation, but it ought to be someone who has some background in, risk assessment or dangerous behavior, to make sure you're going to get as accurate an assessment as possible, because not all mental health professionals are trained in this area.
And is there a phone number that people can call? Is there like a hotline that people can reach out to, or the best is to be with their own communal setting?
Probably best to go to someone local. Since we mentioned my website, there's a page on there called Prevention, and it has about 30 documents on school safety, violence prevention, threat assessment. So there's a lot of resources online, whether it's for a parent or a school official, a mental health worker. I put all those materials together so that people do have a place where they can get the information they need.
Wonderful. Dr. Langman, again, thank you very much for all this valuable information and for your service to our population. This is an area in a great need. Thank you again for being on the show. This is a topic that I am absolutely fascinated by, and I have been reading about this for about 10 years. So this is an absolute honor to have you on the show. And get this great information. If individuals want to reach out to you, should they do it through the website?
Yes, the website does have a contact page if people want to send me an email.
And Dr. Langman offers training programs and lectures for schools and other settings and professional settings as well. So just for our listeners, if you have a need in your community or you think that this is an area that's great to cover, do reach out. I do recommend that very much. This is an area that the more we know about, the more equipped we are to deal with that problem. So thank you very much again for being on the show.
Well, thank you.
And for our listeners, we have some great topics coming up in the next few weeks. We're going to have June 30th an expert that's going to talk to us about mass killing and mass shooting that's terror related. So we're going to have terrorism expert coming on board. Very exciting. We're going to have other interviews that have to do again with various kinds of treatments, related treatments for various kinds of brain conditions. So stay tuned with us. Now, for ones who want to advertise on the show, we've just opened this month the ability to advertise on the Dr. D Show. So if you want to support the show, become a sponsor, donate for the show, or put your ad on, we do have a direct communication line that you can contact us. You can email us at contact@drdgaines.com, and we can have communication. Our team can have a communication with you in that regard. If you enjoyed the show, please do find us on Facebook and like us. And with that in mind, I would like to bless all of you. May we all be safe and healthy, and may we will stay strong in the United States to make sure that our people are healthy and well, and blessings also for the rest of the world for well-being and care. Be well.
You're listening to the Dr. D Show about neuropsychology and well-being. Get the knowledge you must have to live a powerful, positive life. The Dr. D Show. Here for you.